Folks, we're nearing the end of the first day of DefCamp, and I hope you have had a blast. I hope you've had the time to check both the expo area and the hacking village, that you've sampled talks from both tracks that you're interested in, and thank you very much for interacting with us in the chat. We have one more speaker lined up, and I'm really excited to hear his perspective because we talk about security professionals, their arsenal of tools and their knowledge a lot at DefCamp, but I think it's worth also exploring the way in which the board members of these large companies, both those in the public and in the private sector, act on nurturing security and resilience. Brian, who is a VP and CISO of Mandiant Advantage, has a unique perspective on this matter. He has recently had conversations around this topic on his own podcast, and he found that board members are paying close attention to their organization's security programs. Brian, can you give us a sneak peek into this world?
So first off, thank you so much, everybody, for having me here today. I've really enjoyed the talks, great technical content. This is my first time being involved. Hopefully next time I can actually physically be there. It'd be a lot more fun, but this will hopefully be a relatively interesting and fun presentation for all of you. Let me give you a little bit of background. You can't have a presentation title, Cybersecurity in the Board, Choosing Success over the Sarlacc Pit, without a little bit of definition of where that came from. So essentially, as mentioned, I have a podcast called the Cybersecurity Effectiveness Podcast. And every once in a while, I do these micro podcasts within there focusing on military and government or financial services or red teamers or reverse engineers in different sections. But I decided to focus it on board members. And we always talk about in security how security is very strategic and it matters to the executives and it matters to the board. And I wasn't sure if that was just hubris or not. Do they really care? And if they do care, what do they care about? And one of the board members actually told me when he's having conversations with these CISOs and these security executives, it's often like they're falling into the Sarlacc Pit. And I'm sure everybody on this Zoom knows that reference, but just in case you don't, it's a Star Wars reference, actually Return of the Jedi. And it's this pit that if you fall into, you digest very slowly over thousands of years. So you're dying over thousands of years. And while you're doing that, you're being digested. So it's an awful, horrible way to die, clearly. And he was saying that it doesn't have to be that way. The problem is that board members and security professionals often have different perspectives. They care about different things. They want the same goal. They want their organization to be safe and secure and successful, but sometimes they're just not connecting. So what I've tried to put together in this presentation, it's a very short presentation, 30 minutes, but I've tried to cherry pick a few different board members that I interviewed and a few different quotes from them and share those and explore those in a little bit more depth as we go through. So that's really the point of this. It's for those of you who do spend time talking to executives and board members and might like to see, what it is that they care about. A very short background on me. Again, my name is Brian Contos. I'm the VP and CISO over at Mandiant. I've been in security for about 25 years. I've worked really extensively across the world, so over 50 countries. I started with the Defense Information Systems Agency in the US government and then Bell Labs. I was actually living in Sao Paulo, Brazil for a couple of years while I did that. And then when I came back to the United States, I just started building startup companies. So Riptech, ArcSight, Imperva, McAfee, Solaris, Silence, and a whole bunch of others. Most recently, the last company I helped build was called Verident. We were acquired by Mandiant. I've written a couple books and I've done some documentaries and some other things, but let's go ahead and just jump right into this presentation now. Very, very short historical perspective on threats and technology. I think it adds some color to this conversation because it helps frame things in terms of our perspectives. Also, of course, I'm sharing conversations with board members. That's kind of the meat of this. Hitting on business relevance because that seems to be really underscored. With every single board member I talk to, it's how is what you're telling me from a security practitioner perspective important enough for me to put in my myriad of risks. So board members, executives have 10,000 different types of risks they deal with all day long. Cyber is just one. And while it's a critical one, it has to be factored into all the other variables, and some of which might be even more detrimental or have a greater impact to the organization. And then talking a little bit about some of the things that are just hot. What are board members thinking of in terms of this is the tech that's we're hearing a lot about and we care a lot about, things like threat intelligence and incident response capabilities and validation and things like that. So let's just jump right in. The first thing is shrinking threat windows. And again, this is all about framing perspective. And the way I like to do this is I like to look at sea and air and space and internet and kind of those domains, if you will. Sometimes people from a military side will call them domains of war. They'll add land to that as well. But these domains are actually domains of commercialization. When were these areas first commercialized? And then when did those areas first suffer, at least the first documented cases, first suffer some type of threat? So in about 3000 BC in the Mediterranean Sea was our first recorded history of people actually using the sea for commerce. So somebody basically said, look, we've got a bunch of stuff in a boat. Why don't we take it over to this other location and see if they want to buy something or trade something? Well, it took about 1,300 years before we had the first recorded pirates. So 1,300 years before somebody said, why don't we just rob that boat? That's a pretty big threat window. We generally don't talk about threat windows like that in cyber, right? But 1,300 years, pretty big, but it starts to get smaller. So we take air. The first commercialization of air was in about 1859. It was a hot air balloon, of course, and it was used to transport mail. It was a great idea. It crashed and burned. It literally crashed and burned. It turned out to be a failure, but it was sort of the first step into that commercialization. We didn't have the first hijacking. This was actually in Peru until 1931. So again, not 1,700 years, but still a pretty big threat window. And then we go to space. So the first commercialization that we saw in space was just a couple of years after Sputnik. It was a satellite called Telstar. It was run by AT&T. It was for television broadcasting. And that was in 1962. Now, we haven't seen a lot of attacks in space. Certainly, there's a lot of discussion amongst governments and militaries, intelligence agencies, whatnot, as it relates to satellite warfare. Some of this is academic. Some of it's maybe a little bit more than academic. But in terms of cyber criminals trying to exploit space, because of the barrier to entry and how satellites and base stations generally have a one-to-one connection, generally the juice isn't worth the squeeze. It's a little too much effort. But with that said, we have seen some isolated incidents like the Trula data theft that used command and control bots back in 2015 that actually leveraged commercial satellites. So there has been some documentation of this. Finally, the commercialization of the internet. Now there's about 1,000,001 ways to talk about when the internet was actually first commercialized. But most people point to about 1988, people that belonged to NSFNet had a bunch of users using email, or as they called it, electronic mail. And then MCI had the same thing. And they said, hey, why don't we charge our customers and let them email each other? What a concept. But pretty much right about there, 1988 is when we had the Morris worm, which exploited R commands and finger and things like that on Unix systems, and was able to really wreak havoc in the first really prolific worm. There was attacks before that. There was viruses, both theoretical and application. There was PC-based viruses like the brain and other things before this, but this was the first internet-based. So we've gone from about 1,700 years to really zero. And that's about what we see on the internet, right? Our threat windows are generally very, very small. So from a cybersecurity practitioner's perspective, we get all excited about this. Well, we've got a new threat, right? There's a new vulnerability. It's a critical CVE. We've got to address this. We've got to get on it. How come the executive team doesn't understand? We got to take these things down. Why isn't the board acting? And again, to us, it's critical, and to everybody else, it should be critical as well. But it's one of potentially many other critical factors. So if you put yourself in the lens of a board member, yes, we agree this is important, but there's actually 5 other things that are even more timely that we have to address that perhaps you're not aware of. And we're seeing technology shift advantage pretty quickly. If you've ever seen the movie 300, this picture will be quite familiar, but about 323 BC, the Greeks ran the ancient world, right? They were they were the top of the top. And it was with pretty basic technology. They had bronze and they had iron, and they had these phalanx units with spears, and they could work very well collectively if they were on flat terrain and they were moving forward. And with that basic technology, certainly very basic by today's standards, they were extremely, extremely successful. Well, then the Romans came around and they had this new metal called steel, and they had this sword called the gladius sword, which actually they took from Spain, just a little side note. But they said, you know what? Why would we fight these Greeks in a straight line on flat terrain? Why don't we send a group over and flank them from the back? We'll fight them in the woods, on the hills, and the rocks. We'll use guerrilla warfare type techniques. And they were very successful. So from today's perspective, wow, steel and maybe not charging head on into a phalanx unit, it seems pretty basic. But then it was a massive shift in advantage. And again, we're seeing that on the cyber side, both for the bad people that have nefarious intent and those that are trying to stop those with nefarious intent. Technology is being leveraged. And what was thought to be pretty advanced tech, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, today seem to be pretty benign, right? The attacks and the defenses. So we go a little bit more modern, not that much more modern, but a little bit. So we go to 15th century Ottoman Empire, so modern day Turkey. And this is really a take on complexity. So learning to use a longbow could take years, and learning to be really effective at using a longbow could take over a decade. So it takes a long time. That's a big investment into an individual and a group and a part of your military to learn how to use the longbow. Like we've got this guy here standing in the middle. Now, the Janissaries did something that's unique. They didn't invent gunpowder, and they didn't invent the musket. And they weren't even the first group to use muskets in the military, but they were the first ones to embrace it en masse. And they said, you know what? We can train somebody how to use a musket and be pretty effective with that musket in a few weeks. They might not be the best shot in the world, but if you get enough of them lined up in a row, that's pretty darn effective, especially when your enemy is charging you and they've got leather armor, maybe chainmail, and they've got some shields, and they've got swords and spears and pokey sticks. They were very, very effective. So embracing gunpowder, embracing the musket, reduced the complexity and the time it took to train to become effective with their military. And they were highly, highly effective because of this. They were one of the most effective militaries in history, based on, again, what we would consider relatively simple technology, but embracing it in a way that reduced the complexity. And my final example is World War II. This is a World War II Tiger tank. Tiger tanks and Panther tanks that were developed in Germany will sort of be my discussion point here. But if we go back to World War I, in World War I, Germany had about 20 tanks, not a lot, very few compared to what the US and France and England and others had, so extremely small number. But they saw during World War I how effective tanks could be. Not that they were really embraced that significantly in World War I. They weren't. They were there. They were effective, but it wasn't like the Janissaries with their muskets. By the time World War II came around, they had built in a very secret way these tanks. Well, the thing that they did that was interesting is these were extremely, extremely advanced pieces of machinery, far more advanced than what the US had built with our M4 Sherman tanks, what Russia was building and what others were creating. It was super advanced. It was like a finely tuned clock on paper. The problem was it took a long time to train somebody to operate one of these tanks. That was the first issue. A US M4 Sherman tank, if you could drive a car, you could drive a tank. Same thing in Russia. Sometimes the people that were actually driving the tanks and fighting were the people that actually built those tanks a couple months before. At least later in World War II, that was the case. But the problem too with these tanks was that not only was it hard to train people, but supply chain problems. So if the tank gets broken, which tanks tend to do, things fall apart, things get shot at and blown up and fall apart. They didn't have the manpower and the capabilities to supply that supply chain to fix those. So even though it was much, much more advanced, it was way better than any tanks built by the US or anybody else. In operations, it was a failure because of the complexity of training and because of that broken supply chain, and they were not able to support it. So with that, and kind of giving you different perspectives on different things. Again, a very short history, if you will. Let's jump into our first quote here. And this quote is by Art Coviello. And Art Coviello, some of you may have heard of him or maybe even know him. He's been a mentor of mine for many years. But Art was the former president and CEO for RSA Security. But he also sits on a huge number, I couldn't even list them all on the slide, number of boards, especially in the technology, in the security space. And he's also on the board of a publicly traded financial services company. So he has a really broad perspective on sort of what boards think. And he says, and I'll just read these quotes, all companies, big or small, public or private, must embrace cybersecurity as a key issue. Okay, we get that. With today's threat landscape, if you don't, you're not meeting your fiduciary responsibility. And I really love this quote for the fact that it just kind of boils it down to the most simplistic perspective. Look, it doesn't matter who you are, you have to care about it. And if you're not taking time to consider it, you're not doing the most basic thing that you do as a board member, which is your fiduciary responsibility, making sure that the company isn't hemorrhaging money and they're investing in the right places. This is really key because I think if you went back even as short as 5-6 years ago, this wasn't necessarily the perspective. And certainly a lot of board members they're not security experts. A lot of them aren't even that really tech savvy, if you will. But to have somebody that's been in the game this long, to have that perspective and say, look, this is what you have to do, it's really a powerful thing. So it addresses, I think, the initial question that some people have is, do boards really care about, or should they really care about cybersecurity? And plain and simple, the answer is yes. Yes, in fact, they should. So one of the things that I took away from these conversations as well is security isn't really about cyber risk for these board members. And that seems like a weird thing to say. It's like saying security is not about security. But let me dive into that. For them, security, a cyber risk, is about the financial, the brand, and the operational risk that can occur from a cyber attack, not the cyber risk in of itself. And that seems like a very simple thing. Of course they care about finance, brand, and operational risk. But oftentimes I'm told, and this goes back to the Sarlacc Pit comment, that CISOs and other security executives don't approach the conversation from the financial, brand, and the operational risk. They talk about, look how prolific this new bot is, or look what type of impact this ransomware can have on us, or because we don't have incident prevention controls in this part of our network, we're at this level of risk. Instead of talking about, well, what's the financial, the brand, and the operational risk from that cyber attack? Now, we know CEOs care about this. We know board members care about this because they're even talking about it on the news. I'm seeing this around the world. A lot of board members, a lot of CEOs will be on the news, they'll be interviewed, and cyber is brought up and they're discussing it. But more important than just showing up on the news, which is nice because you never heard them talk about it on the news before, is you're seeing cybersecurity mentioned in annual reports, corporate governance documents, and committee charters. These are all their legal, publicly available documents that they have to share with shareholders and stakeholders, right? And within them, let's take an oil company, for example. Oil companies have to worry about a ton of things, everything else that every other business has to worry about, plus environmental issues, military and political issues, issues perhaps related to terrorists, and the list can go on. And guess what? Another bullet, cyber. And cyber can actually have a real impact on their organization, what they call a material risk, which is a risk that actually can have financial impact in the organization. The other thing that we're seeing is, as security practitioners, we've been saying, we need to sit at the board table. We need to sit at the board table for probably far longer than I've been doing this. And I've been doing this for a while. Well, now we have it. Their ears are open. Their eyes are open. They're listening. They're watching. They want to see it. But they want to make sure that you're measuring how effective your security controls are, like other businesses measure how effective they are. So if you think of the chief financial officer, if the CEO asks the CFO, how much money do we have in the bank? And the answer is, well, we do pen testing, we follow PCI, we do best practices, we just did a vulnerability scan, we do this. It's kind of a wishy-washy answer. It's like ROSI, return on security investments. It's about reducing risk. they're probably not going to be the CFO very long. They just want to hear that, hey, we've got $5 million in the bank. And last week we had 3 million. So I guess we're doing better. In security, they want the same thing. They want to know, do you have a way to measure how well our security controls are doing across endpoint and email and network and cloud and prevention, detection and response and all these disparate areas? Can you actually measure it? And can you trend it and just show if we're doing better or not? Like the VP of sales, like the chief financial officer, like the chief operation officer. Again, security has now become strategic. You have to speak like you're a strategic member of the team. And finally, and this is something I just wanted to throw in here because I interviewed a very large number of CISOs, and they were talking about their conversations with not only the board, but with the CEO, CFO, and the rest of the executive team. And this kind of bubbled out as like the 6 basic priorities that they care about. And I think most people on this call would look at these as just the really bare bones basic. But again, this is the mindset. This is what they're thinking about. They're not thinking about, the specifics of a new ransomware attack or some new vulnerability. They're thinking in these broad strokes. So what are the 6 priorities? Securing communication channels like email. I want to be able to send email safely. Protecting my financial systems and my customer data and my intellectual property. Of course, I have to protect all my data, especially those financial systems and customer data and intellectual property. Assuring availability of my critical apps and the infrastructure. Okay, I got to protect it. I got to make sure people can get to it. And I have to make sure that the infrastructure that supports those systems, whether it's in the cloud or it's a SaaS solution or on-prem, that it's secure as well. Safeguarding access. Not only do I want it up and running, but I want to make sure I can control who can get in, and then demonstrating compliance. So placating auditors, checking the box, but hopefully not just saying, yes, we passed the audit, but using the investment in time and resources that we put into that audit to make sure that we're actually getting real security value. This next quote is from Alexa King. She's a very interesting board member because she's actually a lawyer. And in addition to being a lawyer and being an executive vice president for a tech company, she actually sits on boards as well. So she kind of has another unique perspective, as they all really do. And she says, if you provide boards with evidence-based data, and that's important, I should have bolded that, evidence-based data, that's key, regarding your cybersecurity posture, trends, intelligence, effectiveness, etc., they should be able to provide you with valuable input based on their broader perspective. I really like this quote because she's saying it's not just unidirectional. This is bidirectional communication. You're giving information to the board, but hopefully they're giving you information back. And they're saying, yeah, this is important, but please also consider that we're looking at opening up an office in Asia, or we're looking at acquiring this other company, or we're looking at divesting this region. These are things that you might not have been aware of, but things that you can take away. So it's not just going up and presenting, it's having that open bidirectional line of communication to be able to get things back and leverage it. They want to, trust me, they want to be able to share their expertise. That's why they're there. One of the biggest values of having a board member is they sit on lots of boards. They see and hear lots of things. They have a much broader perspective, which is why they're on the board, than the person that actually has to operate the company and do security for the company. So very good input. It should be bidirectional. And again, evidence-based. Of course, she's a lawyer, so she would say evidence-based. But having evidence, having proof, there's no room for guesswork. There's no room for assumptions at this level when you're talking to the board. They want to hear all the good things, but you have to also share all the bad things, and you have to show them the supporting evidence, the proof of where you're getting this. It can't just be high-level conversations about, what you're hearing or what you're seeing or what the potential threat might be. You need metrics at this level. Business relevance. Again, this was underscored many times as a key concept. So things such as across all industries, we know that they rely on critical assets to generate revenue, to be competitive, to deliver services, all these other things. Significant investments are made to ensure that these systems stay up, they stay running in business continuity, people have access to data and customers. Regulatory compliance, again, hopefully going beyond the placation of auditors, but actually getting value from this. Critical asset protection, making sure that those key assets are actually being safeguarded. And a lot of times, we'll use oil and gas as an example. You have these old Windows NT 4.0 machines that have been end of life for years, but they still, in some cases, decades, They still operate multi-million-dollar turbines or pumps, or they control flow or temperature, things of this nature. You need to have systems that protect those systems. So think of it as that onion approach. So they really care about that, keeping the business running. And finally, the biggest one, I think, is rationalization optimization. I'm now starting to see teams that have like a VP of security rationalization or security rationalization teams that their only purpose is actually to be able to determine that money that we just spent $100,000 on for security, are we actually getting $100,000 of value from that? Have we actually optimized? What we find in general is people get maybe 20, 30% of the value from their security controls. Not because they have bad people or bad products or bad processes. They've just never had tools in place to validate and make sure that they're actually getting value from those tools historically. There's tools like breach and attack simulation, security validation that can help with those steps to make sure that you're actually getting value. You can measure that value and you're optimizing those systems. And that again ties into business relevance. This gentleman is Jay Leak. Jay Leak probably sits on more cybersecurity company boards than anybody I interviewed. He was also the former CISO for Blackstone, a very, very large financial services company. And he said, boards and business executives can generally quantify risks brought on by economic downturns, political changes, natural disasters. But understanding preparedness and impact analysis from cyber is often based on assumptions because of a lack of evidence-based measures. There's evidence-based again, right? Representing the effectiveness of your cybersecurity controls. So once again, Jay is underscoring the fact that assumption-based security doesn't work. You need to measure on evidence. And again, if you're talking to a board, it all has to be evidence-based. They want facts. They don't want ideas or gut feelings. Those are all valuable. Those all help. They don't go away for sure. They make you valuable as an operator. But at a board level, you need to be able to present facts. Some of the common security findings that reduce value that we're finding across the board, and I think a lot of you would notice this, that sort of make it so controls aren't optimized, which is a big thing again, optimization and rationalization. We're finding that there's a lot of weak out of the box configurations, like default configs. Somebody installed something during a POC, it turned into a production product, whether it was the vendor or a partner, your own internal team, but it was just the default config, which probably isn't right for you. Misconfiguration of existing controls. A lot of times we find that networks that were supposed to be segmented aren't segmented. We're finding that security controls that were thought to be in place aren't actually in place. And sometimes it's a lack of resources to post-deployment. So something's been deployed, you kind of get it working, but there's so many things that you need to care about, you kind of switch gears and that's just left operating. Most companies we run into have somewhere between 50 and 200 different security vendors within their organization. That's a huge number of things to be, first, just to be able to keep it running, let alone to optimize it and have the risk metrics and make sure it's actually doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's very, very challenging. I mentioned the segmentation flaws as well, but one of the big issues we also see are SIM. So SIM's a huge investment. I spent about almost 7 years at ArcSight, from the early days when SIM was just becoming a thing and we didn't even really call it SIM back then, to when we took ArcSight public and eventually got bought by Hewlett Packard. So I got to kind of see the evolution of it. And SIM is like this superset of everything else that's under you has to work properly. The NTP has to work. You have to be getting your logs. IT stuck a proxy server. Now you're not getting your sys logs, right? Somebody that was supposed to have a bidirectional tap for an IPS accidentally configured as unidirectional, so the IPS drops everything. There's a zillion things that can go wrong reporting to the SIM. Before you start doing SIM stuff, correlation, volumetric analysis, temporal analysis, pattern discovery, anomaly detection, on and on. So a lot of times we see that even before you get the information to the SIM, it's wrong. And then once you do get it to the SIM, do you really have a way to test that this very advanced rule that you've written or this correlational alert is actually going to work? So again, that's where tools like breach and attack simulation and security validation come in. This is Matt Biggie. Matt Biggie was a former U.S. Army Air Force or U.S. Army Ranger. He's also a partner at Crosslink Capital, and he sits again on many, many boards, but his military background adds some color to his interview. He says, audit committees evaluate a wide range of risks, from standardized accounting practices to the composition of boards. In cybersecurity, historically, the audit committees have lacked controls effectiveness evidence, validation measures against threat intelligence, and optimization metrics for incident analysis and response capabilities. So what I really want to hit there is the fact that he's saying, look, it's not enough even to say, are my controls effective or not? And I'm measuring how will this tool work? Or if I run this attack in my network, will it be blocked? Will it be detected? Will I be alerted upon? Will my people know what to do? Will the processes work? But now I want to do that against all the latest threat intel as well. So I'm getting all this great threat intelligence. I need to operationalize it so I can automate it and test it. I need to personalize it. So I want to test it in my environment. I want to safely execute these real attacks that I'm getting, these IOCs and these TTPs within my environment to see how my products, how my people, and how my processes will act under this. You know, do we block? Do we respond? Do we detect? How will this happen? And then give me the facts. This is how good we were at doing this last month. This is how good we're doing it this month. This is how good we are doing it against this very specific attack, right? And I think, again, that's that level of visibility that organizations are looking for. And they're looking for security that's done not just better, but different. And by that, what I mean, it's not the next firewall, the next IPS, the next SIM. It's actually taking a step back and saying, how can I take the things I've got and make them better? So identify a gap, for example, in my system. If I do have a gap using breach and attack simulation or security validation type tools, tell me how to tune that. Then once I've tuned it, let me retest with that attack to see if my security controls are preventing, are detecting, are alerting. And then let me go ahead to avoid environmental drift. Let me automate this. So now I got this information from threat intel. I found out that I've got some systems that are vulnerable to it. I tune my system. I test it now again against that threat intel, and it says, okay, you're secure, you're preventing, detecting, responding. Now I want to test it every single day in perpetuity with 10,000 other different attacks to make sure that that thing that was blocking or detecting or responding and alerting is now still doing it next week and next month and next quarter and next year. By doing that, I can start rationalizing. I can start saying, you know what, we need to invest over here, or we need to prioritize this over this, because I know what's not working and what is working. I'm going way beyond traditional vulnerability scanning or patch management. This is a great way to augment that. And I can very easily map my capabilities to MITRE ATT&CK or NIST, SANS, OWASP, and report and demonstrate the value that my security team is providing. This is Bill Crowe. So Bill Crowe was the former deputy director for the NSA. He was with the NSA for about 35 years, so he knows a lot about threat intelligence. Bill and I actually wrote a book a few years back as well, so he's just a very, very smart person. He sits on a number of boards, and of course, he brings all that intelligence agency background with him. And he says, having an intelligence-led approach to cybersecurity doesn't just make your security team more effective. It provides the evidence leadership needs, there's evidence again, to ensure that your goals and objectives and priorities are aligned with their business requirements in the face of the latest relevant threat actors. So an intelligence-led, again, and we saw intelligence mentioned before, taking that rich intel that you're getting from all your disparate sources, operationalizing it so you can automatically test now IOCs and TTPs within your environment to see what am I able to prevent? If this got into my environment, can I stop it from exfiltrating data? Does it compress information, and does it sort of leak it out via ICMP, for example, or does it create a SSH tunnel? And what will my devices do if it can't see it? How will my people react? So having intelligence-led, instead of intelligence being sort of this late indicator of compromise that you use for forensic analysis, you're actually putting it at the tip of the spear. So you're validating all your security controls against that intel. That is the new, and that seems to be really top of mind threat intel for these board members. Again, threat intelligence, as I said, being the tip of the spear, it's all about making it relevant so you can really focus where your security spend is against not just the old stodgy SQL attacks and command and control type issues and things like that. We still want to test for that because it still works. Everybody here knows that a SQL injection attack that worked 20 years ago, unfortunately, can sometimes still work today. But you also want to test against this latest attack too. Even if it's simple stuff like, do I have a device beaconing to these known malicious IP addresses and domains? Here's Kara Nortman. Kara Nortman sits again on a number of boards, cybersecurity company boards, of course, and technology companies. Her perspective was really, companies are embracing cybersecurity services at an increasing rate. And I won't read the whole quote, but Kara's whole perspective is, look, it's great to have all these tools and security tools and test them with breach and attack and security validation and pull threat intelligence. Academically, yes, this makes sense. But not everybody has the human resources and the expertise to do this effectively. So her perspective on it was very simple. Look, guys, you need to embrace services, whether it's managed services or augmenting your team with incident responders or what have you. This is going to be really key as we go forward, because you're not going to be able to be as effective without sort of having a third party, on retainer or consulting services. There just isn't enough time in the day because of the operational constraints of most people. So we're seeing more people embracing those services, and security teams now having to learn how to manage these outsourced services more effectively. And final thoughts as we wrap up here. Again, security has become extremely strategic. Luckily, we do have the ear of the C-suite and the board, but unfortunately, a number of CISOs are still talking about assumption-based security, what they think is happening, what might occur instead of evidence-based. Hence, they're falling into that Sarlacc pit. And it's not just about tools, it's about the intelligence and the people behind those tools. And validation is one way to make sure your security tools are working. Breach and attack simulation is another. You can also leverage various security services and pen tests, which will at least give you a snapshot. It's better than nothing, but there's a way to automate this. And finally, at the end of the day, where you want to get based on these CISOs is measurable value, measurable ROI that you can actually communicate to them. Now, if you'd like to see any of these podcast interviews, each one's like 30 to 60 minutes long. You can find the Cybersecurity Effectiveness podcast on Spotify or iTunes, on our website, wherever it is you'd like to listen to podcasts. And with that, I think I'm at time. So thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak today.
So much for this perspective. Oh, I just want to shoot one very small question your way, because you talked about this bi-directional communication between board members and the cybersecurity experts who do the execution of strategy. Yeah. Why do you think it breaks down? Is it jargon? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it pre-existing biases on both sides?
I think you're right on all those accounts. Every board member and every CISO or security team is a little bit different. As security practitioners, sometimes we don't realize how much we get bogged into our own jargon. We certainly don't realize how much we get very laser focused on specific attacks or issues we're trying to mitigate, especially the latest, hottest thing that's all over the boards and all over the news. And again, board members need to step back, and they're looking at things in terms of how relevant is this to the business. So having that open communication, we have to continue to educate, but we have to educate them in a language that they speak. We can't expect them to understand us. We need to speak in a way that they'll understand. And I'm seeing a lot of security executives now going through business training. Some have come up through technical backgrounds or different processes. They might not have all the soft business skills. Spending a little time learning that can actually be very helpful as you climb that ladder.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess it works both ways, right? We all got to be good at recognizing when we're speaking jargon and when we're speaking human, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your presentation and for your presence here at DefCamp. It definitely made the first day end on a very high note. Thank you.
This was a pleasure.